Welcome to another edition of Even Darker Journalist. I'm your host for today's installment of Darker Journalist, Triple XXX. That's me, Even Darker Journalist. And today we're going to be talking about something that quite a few people really don't want to get into as far as the conspiracy theory goes, and sort of bringing truth forth in a way that might make people a bit uncomfortable. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the secret space program, and with good reason, because as I've gone through a number of shows in the past where we've looked at people like Werner von Braun, Nikola Tesla, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, even Donald Trump, there clearly is a history of the secret space program right underneath us. And not only that, but there is also an esoteric order and agenda that seems to be connected to the secret space program. On today's version of Even Darker Journalist, we're going to get into a completely controversial topic, and a topic that most journalists on the internet, most dark journalists on the internet won't even approach and won't even touch. It may make you feel a little uncomfortable, a little squeamish perhaps, but in order to get to the truth, we must be able to get into the dark places and the dark spaces of where the truth may actually exist. So be prepared, because for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you into a region of the inner secret space program. And of course, this episode is titled Triple X for a reason. And that reason being is that today I'm going to uncover one of the greatest mysteries and most closely guarded and kept secrets of the 20th century and even beyond. And of course, what I am referring to is the Triple X program. And this is related to the size of a president's member. Now, you may think this is quite funny, and perhaps you think that I'm doing some kind of a Halloween sort of funny one-off kind of show, but no, I guarantee you that what I'm about to divulge today has a profound impact, not only on where history has gone, where it is, but where it's going. In order for us to really get an understanding as to why the phallus has made such an important impact, a powerful impact on culture and government, we have to take a trip back into history. We have to go all the way back to 1915. And in 1915, it is the emergence of a mad Russian monk named Rasputin. Now, why am I bringing Rasputin up, and what does Rasputin have to do with modern day politics, Donald Trump, and of course, the Triple X secret phallus program? Well, it's a good question. But let's go back to those days, 1915, before the fall of the Romanovs and the Russians and the rise of the Bolsheviks. There was a mad monk that descended out of the wilderness and into the court, into the royal court of the Romanovs. And his name was Grigory Rasputin. And he was known as a mystic, a madman. Rasputin would hold court with dozens of women. And apparently, he was not your ordinary religious leader. Now, Rasputin came to power and fame and influence because he healed the young Romanov boy. That's right. The only male heir to the Romanov family and dynasty, who was a hemophiliac, the son of Alexander. Rasputin healed him. He was bleeding to death. And once he was able to establish his credibility as a healer and a mystic, he was able then to have more influence over the court of the Romanovs. It wasn't long after that that Rasputin began to infiltrate royal life and high society in pre-Bolshevik Russia. His salons with women were legendary. And apparently one of the reasons why Rasputin was so popular amongst the ladies of the court and society is because he had an enormous schlong. That's right. In fact, to this day, Rasputin's member is so legendary that it is encased in a jar of formaldehyde, preserved for all eternity. Now, you may look at it and may say to yourself that it looks like a prop from the movie Alien, and perhaps you might be right. But if you pay very close attention and look very carefully at Rasputin's member, you will find that there is what appears to be a permanent wart just on the top of his member. Now, you could only imagine what type of pleasure a strategically placed wart might have on the ladies of the court. Now, Rasputin was also quite prophetic. He shared with Alexander that he should not be involved in the Battle of World War I. And if he was going to get involved, well, there's a very good chance that he would lose his entire kingdom and his family. Alas, Alexander did not listen to the prophetic warnings of Rasputin. The court did fall. And after numerous attempts, Rasputin lost his life. However, his legendary member is still remembered. Remember that. Remember the term member and remember. It plays an important role as we move forward into history and we penetrate the mystery of the XXX program. Let's fast forward. It's 1960, and there are two men running for president of the United States of America. One is John F. Kennedy. The other happens to be Richard Milhous Nixon. Now, Nixon will show up later and for a fairly significant purpose and reason. Now, there's a reason why John F. Kennedy got elected. And it wasn't because of the size of his member. You know, apparently the Kennedy men come up a little short, if you know what I mean. No, the reason why Kennedy was elected was because of Lyndon Baines Johnson. We'll get to him in a minute. Now, to understand the XXX project and the mystery of the phallus, we also have to understand Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon was a Capricorn. We know all about Capricorns. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that Rasputin was also a Capricorn? That's correct. So there are rumors that Richard Nixon was, pardon my coarse language here, but he was hung like a goat, like a Capricorn. And you can, of course, research this on the internet. Now, I've done many hours of research on this topic, and it's clear that Richard Nixon was well endowed, very well endowed. Now, most leaders throughout history have been chosen by the size of their members. This is true. This is absolutely true. Because it was often seen as a symbol of power over not just other men, but also women in the village, the tribe, the state, and the nation. So how could John F. Kennedy, who theoretically had a smaller member than Richard Milhous Nixon, how could he get elected? Well, I gave you a hint. It was Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson had a member so big that he actually had a nickname for it. And that nickname was Jumbo. That's right, Jumbo. A lot of people think that Johnson was there to carry the Southern vote because Kennedy, of course, was from New England. He had a reputation of being a bit of a playboy, certainly a liberal, and a good Southern Democrat like Lyndon Baines Johnson could actually help him carry the ticket. Well, little did they know that the real reason that Lyndon Baines Johnson was on the ticket wasn't because he had connections with the Democratic base. It was because his schlong was bigger than Nixon's. And that's the only way that John F. Kennedy could be elected. It was based on the size of Johnson's schlong. Now, let's be clear. Nixon was very well endowed. Very well endowed. But Johnson, well, Johnson was his equal and then some. So what happened in 1963? Well, people who were involved in the Kennedy administration and beyond, who were part of the XXX Phallic secret society, the Inner Space Program, they decided that John F. Kennedy, no matter how many women he was screwing, would not be able to make up for the fact that Johnson was more well endowed than he was. So as a result of that, a very elaborate ritual was taking place on 11/22/1963. Now remember, 11 represents the Twin Towers. That's right, the Twin Towers. Keep that in mind. Kennedy was assassinated on 11/22/1963, not because he was going to reveal that there were aliens amongst us, not that he was going to reveal that there was a grand conspiracy being run by Jewish bankers, not because he was going to end the Vietnam War, not because he was going to create a new currency, but simply he wasn't man enough. So therefore, Lyndon Baines Johnson took over the presidency. It was LBJ and Jumbo from 11/22/63 onward. Now, there was a lot going on behind the scenes between 1963 and 1968 when Richard Milhous Nixon decides that he is going to run for president one more time. Well, because Nixon did not want to lose, he decided to take drastic measures between his loss to Kennedy and the next electoral process. What did Nixon do? Why do you think Nixon was so interested in China? Why do you think Nixon decided after all these years that China was going to be welcomed into the West? There's a reason. You see, Nixon went to China so that he could make his member longer. This is where he got the nickname Tricky Dick. Okay? He got the nickname Tricky Dick because he went to China and he actually went through very rigorous ancient Chinese rituals in order to ultimately be bigger than Jumbo. Now, here's what happens at the Bohemian Grove. When members of the elite go to the Bohemian Grove, they're not just partaking in some kind of secret sect rituals to Baal and Baphomet. No, they're doing something more. Each one of them is being measured up, man by man, inch by inch. And their power and influence is accordingly distributed after each Bohemian Grove gathering. So in 1967, Richard Nixon, after having spent at least half a year in China, lengthening his member, decided to attend the Bohemian Grove. And when that happened, and the other Bohemian Grovers were there and present, well, let's just say it was a slam dunk that Richard Nixon was going to be the next president of the United States. Now, some people believe that Johnson did not run again because the Vietnam War was such a debacle, that he had invested so heavily in the fact that it was a winnable war and it wasn't. The rules of engagement meant nothing when it came to the Vietnam War and Johnson's final decision. No, Johnson was demoralized because Tricky Dick had outwitted him. And Tricky Dick was the bigger and better candidate. So once Nixon became president, he did a number of things. First of all, he welcomed China back into the West, which was unprecedented. This was a political payback for China because they helped him increase the size of his member and thus become president. Not only that, but he tied the currency, the American dollar, to the entire world and created the petrocurrency, the petrodollar. This might have been Nixon's greatest achievement. However, Nixon wanted more. That's right. Nixon had grand plans because he had been emboldened by the fact that he had won the election. Not by getting more votes than Johnson. Johnson didn't even run. And by the way, his opponent during the 1968 election, Hubert Humphrey, he couldn't measure up. So what happened with Nixon is what happens with many men. He became cocksure, arrogant, and he decided to have more grand plans that would evolve out of the Oval Office. Nixon's biggest plan was to de-link the United States government from the Federal Reserve. Now, even though he was incredibly well endowed, well, the powers that be just wouldn't have it. They looked around and they tried to find somebody, anybody, who could replace Nixon. Well, the only man that was up for the job was not Gerald Ford. No, Gerald Ford was a payback due to the Warren Commission, which he served on and obviously lied about to the American people around the assassination of John F. Kennedy. No, it was Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller became vice president of the United States and ran the entire country, while Gerald Ford went off and played golf and hit people in the head with golf balls. Now, Rockefeller's size also is legendary. And in fact, not only was he well endowed, but he used it on many, many, many occasions, leading up to his death with two women. Yes, that's how Rockefeller died. He had two women in bed with him, and he suffered a heart attack. But it was a brief period in time where the Rockefeller family was running the country, and while he might not have been as big as Nixon, he was certainly big enough. Now, unfortunately, here's where we come to a really demoralizing part of the American story in the XXX Phallic project. You see, the next president of the United States was Jimmy Carter. Now, there's a lot of speculation that Carter had a reputation on those submarines that he was on, which is one of the reasons why he was brought up as the Democratic candidate. Now, Carter, however, had never been to the Bohemian Grove. And they were desperately trying to find out the actual capacity of Jimmy Carter's manhood. It was near impossible. However, the Trilateral Commission did vouch for Carter and said that Carter was man enough for the job. Now, what happened after that is tragic. There's a reason why Jimmy Carter was known as a peanut farmer. That's right. Use your imagination. Jimmy Carter did not last 4 years because they eventually found out the truth behind Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not man enough for the job. Now, this is very interesting and posed an incredible crisis for the XXX Phallicon project. And what happened after that is historic. Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States of America. Now, it was never confirmed if Reagan was actually as large as Johnson or Nixon. But in some ways, it didn't matter because there was a young man in the Reagan administration who was really the de facto XXX agent. And that man was Dick Cheney, the appropriately named and titled Dick Cheney. He'll show up later in our story. But it's Cheney and his apparent size that is literally the backbone of the Reagan administration. Now, during the Reagan administration, many things were accomplished. The fall of the Soviet Union, the first mutterings of a space war and the secret space program. These were some of Reagan's accomplishments. And they're very important accomplishments. But really what happens is that Reagan paves the way for who would be the next president. That would be George Bush. That's correct. George H.W. Bush. And again, Dick Cheney would play a large role inside of the Bush administration and would continue to play a large role inside the Bush administration for a number of years. We'll come back to Dick Cheney later. Now, unfortunately, Senior Bush, he didn't really measure up either. Even if he had Big Dick around, he didn't measure up. So when it came to be elected again, of course he lost the election. No, he didn't lose the election because of the fact that the Clintons and the Bushes are intimately related and connected. That had nothing to do with it at all, even though they are. And it was like having another version of Bush in the White House. No, the reason why he lost and the reason why Bill Clinton was elected was because Bill Clinton actually had a malady with his member. And the malady that he suffered from his member is something called Peyronie's. And what happens with Peyronie's is that when a man gets an erection who has Peyronie's, it is often painful because there's a certain amount of scar tissue that has built up inside the penile wall. Now, one of the other characteristics of Peyronie's is that the phallus will curve. And when Bill's accusers were able to finger him because of his, how shall we say this, irregularity, it was because they were able to describe to a T and a degree the curvature of his member with Peyronie's. Now, it's rumored that his member does curve to the left. You can make up your own mind around this. But it was this condition that set Bill Clinton apart from all the other competitors and people that wanted to reach the Oval Office and sit in the seat of the presidency, where the XXX project is enacted year by year on a daily basis. Clinton, of course, had a very good run, and it was the Peyronie's that assured him at least 2 terms. Now, what happens after this is we have yet another election, and the election happens to be between Al Gore and George W. Bush. Here's a very interesting aspect of that election that is not talked about very often. And it has to do with the election results in Florida. What did they call that controversy? The hanging chads. That's right, that was code. Hanging chad was a code word because they weren't really counting votes in Florida. What they were trying to do was they were trying to determine who was bigger. Was it Al Gore or was it George W. Bush? You see, that was the real hanging chad controversy. Whose chad hung lower? It had nothing to do with the tabulation of the votes. And there was a lot of controversy around the hanging chad. So behind closed doors, secret meetings, Bush and Gore were measured up. And for the first time in history, there was a tie. Both men were of the same length. And there was a conundrum. A conundrum set in. What would be the tiebreaker? Remember, I talked about Dick Cheney, who served under both Reagan and George W. Bush's father. When Dick Cheney decided that he was going to break the tie, it was clear. It was clear that Cheney-Bush was going to be the winner of that election. And the hanging chad mystery, the hanging chad conspiracy was solved. This is part of the XXX project, which I'm breaking today. Now remember, no other journalist on the internet has gone this far, this deep, and this dark with this information. We had 8 years of George Bush. And during those 8 years, within the first year, we had the collapse of the Twin Towers. That's right. The Twin Towers, in many ways, represented the equidistant length between Bush and Gore. Well, those had to go. This symbol of equality had to be eradicated, destroyed. And something else had to be erected in its place. A tower much bigger, much greater, much grander than ever before. And this is what happened. A lot of people think that the collapse of the Twin Towers had to do with many things. It had to do with the fact that the towers might have been filled with asbestos and they had to be collapsed because they couldn't be removed. Maybe it had to do with the fact that it would set up the project for the new American century and the Patriot Act. Perhaps it had to do with the fact that there would be groups that would seize power during that dark, dark period that ensued after 9/11. All these things, while they may sound very logical on the surface and very rational on the surface, it was about building a bigger building. That's what it was about. They had to erect a larger building than the two that were supposedly equal. Once that occurred, we were ushered into a new era, a brand new era of the XXX phallic secret conspiracy. Because once George Bush left office, guess who was elected? Barack Hussein Obama. And yes, Obama was also known for the size of his member. The rumors were ricocheting off of the bathhouse walls in Chicago. Obama was legendary. He was one of the biggest personalities in those bathhouses in Chicago. Word spread very quickly about the potential for Obama and how his size could carry the day for the XXX Phallic project. And of course, he got elected, not once, but twice. The first time he was elected, well, he was up against John McCain. And let's face it, Sarah Palin was better endowed than John McCain, even though she was a woman. We have to be very polite about a subject like this because, of course, John McCain has since left and passed, but it was a slam dunk. There was no way McCain was going to be bigger and better than Obama. Now, the next election was a very curious one because Mitt Romney was running against Obama. And there have long been rumors that Mitt is quite a man. However, just like McCain, Mitt didn't measure up. So Obama was able to come to having his final term as president. He's able to win, and it too was a slam dunk. Now, this posed a problem for both the Republicans and the Democrats in the 2016 election because the Democrats really didn't have anybody who could truly measure up. In fact, they went into the opposite direction. They chose Hillary Clinton, who, by the way, is quite powerful, but is not part of the XXX secret phallic conspiracy project. And for Donald Trump, again, it was a slam dunk. Why? Because even though he has small hands, Hillary is a woman. That's right, she's a woman. And even though she may have the balls of the Clinton family, she's still a woman. And Donald Trump, small hands and all, was able to defeat Hillary. And this is how Trump got elected. Because if there was another Democratic candidate that was bigger than Trump, there's a very good chance that Donald Trump would not be the 145th president of the United States today. Now, some will say that Trump has overcompensated in his life by building these enormous hotels that penetrate the sky. It's quite possible. It's quite possible. And perhaps it was his ability to erect these magnificent structures that helped get him elected. We have another 2 years and another term, perhaps, in Donald Trump's future. But as we've seen with the secret XXX phallic conspiracy, there's no telling who will come along and be the bigger and better candidate. You've been listening to Even Darker Journalist, and this is the XXX secret phallic conspiracy program. Tomorrow, I'll be back and I'll be talking about the Beto effect and why men who aspire towards positions of power like to wear dresses. Until then, thank you for joining. It's always my pleasure to be with you. You've been listening to Even Darker Journalist.